and do a couple more examples of linear regression. So I've dug up a couple more sets of data that we can use to practice and kind of put together the questions that I would ask you after doing a set of data like this. So I'm going to shrink this down here. Hopefully you're still going to be able to see it. You should be able to. Make it a little bigger. It's over. Okay, so here to the left you'll see a set of data that I pulled off a website that's talking about the hours that you spend studying versus your SAT math score. Okay, so this is data that was collected from students who had taken the SAT. They reported how many hours they studied, and we want to look and see if that's correlated with their SAT score, which is something you would want to do to be able to convince people that, you know, the more you study, the better your score is. Or maybe you would find out that there wasn't a relationship between the two, that the number of hours you spend studying does not necessarily influence your score. So the very first step is to get all of this data here entered into my calculator. And to do that, I'm going to use the Stat button, which is right here next to the arrow key. And my very first option is Edit. That's what I'm going to use to put my data into my lists. Now, if you have numbers in the lists already, remember you can go up to where it says L1 and hit Clear and then Enter. Mine's not really going to do anything because it's already empty. But if you had something there in list 1 and list 2, you'd want to hit Clear and then Enter. Just don't hit Delete. And now I'm going to start by entering this first column of numbers under L1. So bear with me here. You could be doing this along with me. Okay, so 20 numbers in that list, which means my L2, which is going to be the SAT score, better have 20 numbers as well. You want to be careful and make sure that you don't miss any numbers anywhere. Oops, I had to type a 1, meant to type a 350. Okay, so I've got my 20 numbers in my list 1, my 20 numbers in my list 2. I'm ready to start looking for my line of regression. So to get to that, I'm going to hit Stat, and then go over to Calc, and then option number 4 is line of regression. And on these calculators, you get this crazy screen, and you're just going to scroll down to the bottom and hit Calculate. If your calculator just comes up and says Lin Reg, just on a blank screen, you would just hit Enter again. But this is what my data looks like. Now I'm actually going to blow this back up here because now I've got this information, and now I want to look at these questions at the same time. And these are the same types of questions I'm going to ask you on all of these types of problems. Okay, so first it says calculate the line of regression. Well, that means write a linear equation. And that's what your calculator has given you here, where it says y equals ax plus b. The a is going there, and the b is going there, and then that's going to be your linear equation. So my line of regression would be y equals, and you can round these off, so 25.3 x plus 353.2. And we're going to talk in a minute about what those numbers represent. But again, I'm taking that just from here and here. Okay, then it says calculate the correlation coefficient. Remember, the correlation coefficient is R, and you want to take that out to a couple of decimal places. So I would maybe say 0.934. Okay. Next, it says interpret the strength of the linear relationship based on the correlation coefficient, which you remember was this right here. So I want to know, how strong is this correlation? Well, remember, 1 is the strongest, so 0.934 is pretty strong, and it's positive, which means as the list 1 numbers go up, which was your number of hours, the bigger your number of hours, the higher your SAT score in general. Okay, interpret the slope in context. So when it asks you this question, make sure you're going all the way back up to your slope, which is from your linear equation. This number right here is your slope. And I don't think we got to this in class yesterday in any of my classes, but here's what that slope is really talking about. I could write it as a fraction. I don't know, numerically we really would never do this, but we could write it as a fraction by writing it as 25.3 over 1. And remember that slope is your change in your y values over your change in your x values. Well, in this case, because we were using our lists, the y values are really like our L2, and the x values are really like our L1. Okay? So L2, that was my SAT score. And L1, that was my hours. So here's what that means if I connect it here and here. That means for every hour I spend studying, for every 1 hour of studying, I would expect my SAT score to increase, because it's positive, by that many points, by 25.3 points. So in general, based on this line of regression that we came up with, for every hour I spend studying, my SAT score should go up by about 25 points. Then it says, predict the score of a student who studied for 16 hours. Well, remember, the hours were my x's, my L1. Okay, so I'm going to go back up to my equation here and plug that 16 in for x. So I'm going to say y equals 25.3 times 16 plus 353.2. And calculate that. And to calculate that, I'm going to go back to my regular calculator screen and just type in 25.3 times 16 plus 353.2. And so I would expect my score, if I studied for 16 hours, to be 758. Now, is that a perfect predictor? No, it's not exact. But that correlation is a pretty strong one, which means there's a pretty positive relationship here. And back on this site, I'm going to put a link to this site here where I pulled this data off of. Let me pull this over here for a second. It's got a great breakdown step by step of how to enter the data. It shows you how to create the scatter plot on the screen. Remember that you don't really have to know how to do that for our purposes, because any of these scatter plots you're going to have to do by hand anyway. The problem with the calculator is it doesn't give you the numbers on the axes, so these points really mean nothing if you don't know what numbers they correlate with. It shows you how to get your line of regression. Look, they got the same answer we did. That's good news. Talks about graphing the line of regression. Again, if I were to have you do that, I would do it by hand. Talks about the correlation coefficient. So this would be a great place to kind of come back and look if you're stuck on the calculator commands. Okay. And by the way, this little side note up here, this is a really helpful example for the other lesson that you're working on, 3.5. So if you can read this and follow this, this might be a good shortcut for you for some of those problems too. Okay. I'm going to work on a second video with a second set of data. So if you're still feeling confused, let's try it one more time.